Welcome back. We're now starting Unit 4, which deals with the three-dimensional art media techniques. So we're looking now at sculpture. So when we're talking about sculptural forms of art making, one of the things to pay attention to is this concept of whether the methods of making sculpture fall under the additive category or the subtractive category. Basically, items to one another or removing material in order to create the image. So definitely try to associate the additive or subtractive category with the four methods that we're going to be looking at today. Modeling is our first method that we'll look at. It is, generally speaking, additive. The material most often used for modeling would be something soft and pliable like clay or wax. You may run into the term plastic, a plastic material, and this does not mean that it is made out of plastic. Rather, it means that the material itself is flexible, pliable, stretchable, can be modeled. Generally, the tools you use for the most part are your hands. The assemblage technique is also an additive sculptural method, and it makes use of what we call found objects. Found objects are literally, could be anything. It's objects that have been found either in nature or man-made things that are come across that an artist collects and uses. A found object could be literally any object that somebody went out and found. So assemblage sculpture involves almost a three-dimensional approach to sculpture that's similar to collage. You're taking pieces and attaching them to one another. So you might do that with any number of different methods. It could be glued, it could be welded, it could be bolted, you could use other mechanical means like nails or screws. Assemblage is, generally speaking, more of a 20th century art making technique. At least in Western art, we don't see a ton of assemblage really in Western art history early on. Carving, though, is a technique that has been around since the very first sculptures that human beings made. So the very first sculptural objects are in fact stone carved. So carving, of course, is a subtractive method. You can think of it as taking a large block of material and removing elements from it, removing material from it until you have achieved the image that you're trying to make. Casting is a category unto itself. So casting is probably the most complex, most involved technique. Basically, though, an artist will create the original object in something soft or pliable, usually clay or wax. Then a mold is made around that object, and depending on which technique is being used, the mold can either be removed, or in the case of wax, the original object could be melted out of the mold. But essentially, you end up with a form that has a hollow space inside it. And if liquid molten metal that's been heated until it is in a liquid state can be poured into that negative space inside the mold, it will then take on all of the detail of the original object. Probably the simplest example of casting is if you've ever had to fill an ice cube tray. That is what we would call an open face mold. It is a single piece. You pour a liquid into it. When the temperature is lowered, that liquid becomes hard and it takes on the shape or the form of the negative space in the mold. So casting is a technique that really has evolved quite a lot over time, but it is something that has been practiced by cultures as far back as the ancient Greeks. So we definitely have examples of cast sculpture in metal that go back literally hundreds, even thousands of years. Another way of categorizing sculpture that we need to think about is whether the sculpture is fully three-dimensional or if it's attached to some form of background. So sculpture that is in the round means a piece that might be on a pedestal or it might be entirely freestanding, but it's an or a sculptural form that can be seen from 360-degree view all the way around. A relief sculpture, on the other hand, would be something that either is carved into or projects outward from an otherwise flat background. Usually these are mounted or hung on walls. A simple way of thinking about a relief sculpture is to think of the head of a president on a coin. Those would qualify as very low relief images. They project a slight amount from the background surface of the coin, but they don't stick out terribly far. Relief can be divided into two major categories. We have low relief or bas relief. Again, there's that French word for low. Low relief means that there's not a lot of differential in space between the deepest part of the relief and the part that extends the furthest. High relief, on the other hand, or what we call haute relief, will have a very extreme difference between the lowest recessed area and the part of the relief that extends the furthest. We can also look at how sculpture relates to the environment in which it's placed. We can categorize sculpture as being monumental. Now, this could be a monument or a memorial to an event or to a person. Usually these sculptures are fairly large and they're in public spaces. We could, though, also refer to a monumental piece, even if it's not a memorial to a specific person or event, if it's just a piece that is of enormous size. Another type of sculpture that's relatively new, 20th century, 21st century idea, is the category of installation. Installation sculpture is a little different from other forms. Other forms of sculpture, we tend to look at a single object that is either projecting from a background as a relief or is perhaps on a pedestal as a freestanding in the round sculpture, but it's a single object. In installation work, we're generally looking at a multitude of objects that may not actually be attached to each other, may not be connected to one another. The idea of an installation, though, is that it creates a three-dimensional environment. You need to kind of walk through the space, see it from a multitude of different angles to really be able to experience this type of sculpture. So installation could be indoors or outdoors, but generally the way to recognize it is that you'll see lots of individual pieces that make up one complete artistic statement or one complete idea. We also have, since the 1960s really, the advent of what we call earthworks or earth sculpture or natural art. The idea of an earthwork is that it's sculpture almost always out of doors, but generally made of entirely natural materials, as opposed to things that are overly manipulated by human beings or that are made from materials like paint or things that are manufactured. And earthwork, more often than not, is made directly from and with the earth itself. So increasingly over time, earthworks have become less and less dependent upon heavy earth-moving equipment like cranes or bulldozers. And in fact, a lot of contemporary earthworks artists tend to work with materials that are meant to decay rather quickly. Things that can be scattered by the wind or that might melt or dry up, things that will change over time. So earthwork is very often a statement about our relationship to the natural world. And it does another thing that's kind of fascinating. It, by its very nature, is rather difficult to have earthwork sculptures in a museum or in a gallery setting. So it does sort of break the idea of art being only for an elite class. It could be something that you encounter in nature and is then something that can't be bought or sold. It's an experience that you have in the real world. We also have the category of kinetic sculpture. That's a really relatively simple one. Kinetic just means that the object is able to move. So some sculptures are mechanized. They may have motors to cause movement. More often than not, the movement is caused by interaction with nature, usually with the movement of air to cause something to sway or to swing or to move. Light is another category for sculpture that is a little bit unusual. We usually think of sculpture as being a three-dimensional object, something you could touch or hold, but we often realize that sculpture is very much about three dimensions, about an experience that takes place not on a flat surface, but in a three-dimensional space. So you could create a three-dimensional experience without something that you would be able to touch through the projection of light. And several sculptors in the 1960s, really through the 2000s, have been working in the use of light to define and alter our experience of space. So this becomes a new-ish form of sculpture. So not to insult anyone's intelligence, but I wanted to give a very basic example here of how modeling works. This is an air drying clay that a middle school art student is using. And you can see that the material can be pinched, pulled, stretched. It is pliable, it's malleable. And so this material will allow you to manipulate and shape the image that you want. We could also call it an additive process, because generally with most clays, even if you start with one lump of clay and you've arranged it, formed it the way that you want it to be, you can attach more clay to it. So of course it's additive in that sense. Obviously, you could take a tool and remove some of the clay. You could scrape some of it away. So in some respects, you could make an argument that modeling in clay could be a subtractive technique. But for the most part, the majority of the work that a person would do with a pliable material like clay or wax would be additive. Another thing to be aware of when we're working with this type of material, clay or wax, of course, are relatively soft. So objects that have to react against gravity to support their own weight may need to be reinforced on the inside. If you think about trying to make a horse out of clay, the torso, the stomach and head of the horse need to be able to be supported by relatively thin elements, the legs. And if you make the object really large, if it's very heavy, if the clay is very wet, then it could start to sag and droop, especially in the middle where the stomach is. So we have the advent of a material or a methodology called the armature. The armature is usually made of wire, and it is a support inside of a sculpture made usually of clay or of wax. So you can see the art students there from probably the late 60s, early 70s. Weirdly, they look a lot like my parents at that time. They are making portraits of the model who's sitting at the left there. And you can see that they have kind of a wooden support with wires attached to it to create the basic shape of the skull, and they're adding clay onto that armature to be able to render her face. So clay is a material that's been around for centuries, and artists have used it in a number of different ways, but I wanted to show you some examples of sculptures that actually have existed for a remarkably long time. These figures were discovered in the tomb of the Chinese emperor, the first emperor of China, and they date from roughly the year 200 BCE. So we're looking at artwork that is made of a material that is relatively fragile. I'm sure most of us have broken a cup or a plate or two in our lifetime. We know that clay is a relatively fragile material, that it can break. And so here you are seeing literally over 6,000 roughly life-sized figures of people, animals, soldiers. There's even some objects that are included in this sculptural grouping that are of chariots and carriages that can be pulled by horses. It's just a remarkable tribute to the first emperor of China. And so these pieces are well over 2,000 years old, and they're in incredibly good condition. The sculptures themselves, most of the human figures are hollow, and in fact there are a handful of similar types. There are 4 or 5 different heads, torsos, and legs that could be combined in different ways. So they each seem to be very unique, but they are actually made on sort of copying the same 4 or 5 basic types and mixing and matching those parts. But they are really rather remarkable that they still exist and that they have as fine detail as they do. You can see how expressive those faces really are and how much detail there is, especially in their armor. We can go from sort of large-scale sculpture to extraordinarily small scale. I thought you guys might like the work of Charles Simmons. His work very often, the work he presents in galleries, can look a lot like miniatures for special effects shot in a fantasy movie. This could be perhaps a castle or a fortification from something like Game of Thrones. He makes very, very small scale architectural work out of clay, but one of his most interesting projects was taking art out into the real world. He started making these small ruins out of small clay bricks and placing them in unexpected places throughout New York City, and this began in the 1970s. So you can imagine how odd it was to be walking past a building that either had damage or maybe was being renovated or even torn down, and discovering what looked like the abandoned dwellings of a tiny of small human beings. They look a lot like the ruins that were left behind in the American Southwest by some early Native American communities. And so you can see that there is kind of a sense of humor to these, but a connection to trying to make art relatable to everyday people. It's kind of interesting to see people reacting to them. In this shot here, you can see how appealing these images were to children as they were discovered in the city of New York. Moving to the method of assemblage, which is kind of a fancy pants way of pronouncing it. It sounds sort of, in a lot of cases, people will pronounce the word assemblage. And that's basically what it is. You're assembling artwork out of a multitude of different. Perhaps the most famous American sculptor to work in this way is Louise Nevelson. Louise Nevelson is a female sculptor who specialized in work in wood and in metal, but used primarily assemblage as her main technique. So she would collect objects, very often parts of buildings, pieces of architecture or decorative elements from interiors of buildings that were being renovated or torn down, and then she would combine those objects together, usually in wall reliefs, and then unify them by painting them a single color, either entirely white or entirely black. More often than not, the work is very abstract. Until you see her titles, you may not recognize any kind of symbolism in them at all, or any image that you could recognize. The object at the far right, in white at the top, is actually part of a large-scale installation of multiple pieces that was to depict the concept of a wedding, and this is meant to look like the front of the chapel. It looks somewhat like the doors and towers leading into a large-scale church or tabernacle of some kind, a temple, a religious space. The one at the bottom is my personal favorite. This one is known as Rain Garden, and at first glance it may not look like plants until you start looking at the circular forms that repeat, that feel a bit like drops of water, and you see that there's so many curved forms in here that look quite a bit like leaves. It very much has the effect of water moving over plants in a very, very abstracted way. There are plenty of other artists who do this type of work in terms of combining materials. These are all sculptors who tend to rely primarily on welding metal objects together, usually steel. This particular artist made his fame off of using car parts, particularly cars that had been involved in accidents, and so he would go to junkyards and source his material there. So you can sometimes date the work based on the color scheme of the car parts, being used. Perhaps one of the more interesting assemblage artists of the 20th century is Marcel Duchamp, who really has had a massive impact on contemporary art, and quite a number of our current art students, our art majors, are really interested in what Duchamp was about. Duchamp was one of the leaders of an art movement known as Dada, which was a kind of made-up nonsense word. And the artists of the Dada movement really were intentionally trying to make art that was a little bit confrontational, a little bit intentionally offensive sometimes even, work that was meant to push the boundaries of what art could do, that was meant to provoke a response, it was meant to be anti-tradition. And one of the reasons for this, and I always like to think that art relates to the time period in which the art was made. Think about the times that you have lived in. There has certainly been an enormous number of unexpected, chaotic events. Even if you are only 18 or 19 years old, you've seen a lot of major political and social events happen in your lifetime, which might make you feel confused or upset or angry about a variety of issues. That's very much the world of the Dada artists. In fact, they were coming to the forefront around the time of the First World War, which at the time was called the Great War, or the war to end all wars. People really felt that this massive global conflict might be the last time that we had warfare on that kind of level. And of course that didn't happen. So the artists of this movement felt that life had gotten out of control. The sheer number of people who were killed in the First World War was shocking to them. They were no longer interested in the status quo. They didn't want to make art the way grandparents had made it, or the way it had been made traditionally for centuries. If you think about it, the art that had been most admired in Western art history was the art of Greece and Rome. And so we're looking at art from several hundred years before the birth of Christ, style lasting throughout the Roman Empire, so several hundred years after that event. That style then being revived in the Renaissance, roughly around the year 1400, being expanded on a little bit during the Baroque in the 1600s, and then being revived yet again by artists who call themselves the neoclassical artists in the mid to late 1700s to the early 1800s. So we had literally centuries worth of artists making art in a way that was fairly similar to a particular way of thinking about art. And the Dada artists wanted to break that apart. So they intentionally made work that was kind of bizarre and very often was made of what we call found objects. So you certainly can see found objects here in the center. A bicycle wheel attached to a stool is ridiculous. It's nonsensical, and it makes the bike not function, the wheel can't function the way it should, and the stool can't be used the way it's intended. The piece on the right is an old-fashioned iron, which you would have to heat on a stovetop, but it has a row of tacks or nails attached to it. So obviously you can't use it for its intended purpose. So these are definitely works that would provoke derision, would make you question what you were seeing. Probably the most controversial one, of course, is the one on the far left, which is a urinal that the artist has signed with a fake name and put a date and exhibited as a sculpture. It's an object from the real world. He didn't really do anything to it other than change its orientation and put his name on it. It is definitely meant to be a provocative statement and to make us think about the limits of what art is, what it can be. And of course, there were plenty of people when this type of work was being made for the first time who were hugely offended by it. And I think that's partially what the Dada artists wanted to do. They very much believed that the world was out of control and chaotic, and that art needed to reflect that. In the 1960s in particular, the movement of pop art reintroduced interest in not only the human figure, again, after a period of very abstract, non-objective painting styles, but also incorporation of things from our everyday lives. And you see that here in the work of the sculptor Marisol Escobar. Her work very much is about referencing what it's like to be, especially female, but a human the late 20th century. Her objects are almost always made of wood, but with other materials attached to them. So there may be found objects used like the baby carriage or the shoes, even sometimes the hats, sunglasses, things that people can wear are incorporated quite frequently into her works. On to carving. Not that this piece is the best sculpture in the universe, but I wanted you to get the idea of how an artist has to think. This is a really process. I was able to be an assistant on a very large-scale stone carving project a few years ago, and it was fascinating to me trying to visualize what the sculpture would look like inside of this huge block of marble that was being carved. So what you're seeing, if you look closely, you can see there is some drawing on the front of this block of marble that is giving our artist a guide. And you can see that already they've started to carve out these edges to take stone away from these outer elements to kind of round those corners. And as you can see, as we progress with the carving, the image becomes more and more recognizable as more and more material is removed. The difficulty, of course, with carving is that if you accidentally remove something that you need, you can't just magically reattach it. So artists really have to plan very carefully for their images to appear the way that they want them to. It is very painstaking, difficult work to do. These students really should have safety gear on, particularly eye protection, but you do get a sense of how physically hard it is to do this work. Most people who are successful in stone carving are working in very hard materials like granite, marble, and other materials of that type. Most students would start with softer stones, one of which that we use on campus quite frequently is soapstone, and it's a little softer, slightly easier to carve. The types of tools, though, look more or less like this. At the top left, you have a series of different chisels and mallets, which are used to remove the stone. So again, you're really having to think in terms of imagining the image that you want to create inside of a larger block that you're going to be taking elements away from. It's kind of remarkable to think that these are carved sculptures. When you see how much intricate detail is there, how many different types of textures have been imitated, these are works by, on the left, the Baroque sculptor Bernini, on the left, early Italian Renaissance master Donatello, and on the left we have a piece carved in marble, on the right a piece carved out of wood. So you can see that a master carver, especially one who's adept at creating representational images, should be able to imitate the appearance of skin or hair, textures like feathers, clouds, depictions. That is the entire chapel, or altar rather, where Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa is displayed. So he not only created this altarpiece, he created all of the architecture around it that makes it look almost like a stage that's kind of bowing outward toward us. And the patrons, the people who paid for it, are depicted in these relief sculptures, almost like they're sitting in theater boxes looking in at that image in the center. Pretty remarkable. So lost wax casting. Casting, again, is its own category. It is neither entirely additive nor entirely subtractive. This gives us a good glimpse of the steps that would be taken to create a sculpture in a traditional form. There's a hyperlink there for you. If you open this as a PowerPoint, you can link to the video itself. I've pulled some screen grabs from it so that you can see the process. This is the original sculpture being been created by the artist, and we're now making a mold of that original. So the hands here are adding plaster to that surface. So you can imagine then this is the original sculpture and this is the plaster mold, which is being removed in two parts. So you can even see the face kind of recessed in this surface. So if you make your mold properly, it is able to be removed from the original object, which can be put off to the side. Then these two halves can be put back together and we could put metal inside. So in this case, we're actually going to make this sculpture as a hollow core, and the reason for that is it will be lighter and it will take less material. So in order to make it hollow on the inside, in our next step of the casting process, we're going to coat a thin coating of wax all around the inside of the mold. The action that's happening here is kind of swishing the liquid wax all the way around so it fills in all of those crevices and gives us a coating. So if we were to remove it at this point, we would have a completely hollow wax replica of our original piece. And so you can really cut it apart like this. This shot is just so that you can see that the amount of wax that's been put in there is relatively thin, and the interior of that shape, or form rather, is completely hollow. The next thing that would happen is we would fill the interior of the head with a plaster to fill in that negative space. We're then adding these sticks of wax. You can think of them almost like the on-ramps of a freeway system. The idea here is that this will facilitate the flow of the metal when it's in its liquid state so that it reaches all points of your sculpture. This is called our sprue system, S-P-R-U-E. We're also pushing pins through the wax and into the plaster core. That will help to hold the core in place when the wax element is removed. So now you see here they're adding plaster around the outside. We could have put the plaster inside the wax replica of the head earlier. We could do it at this point, but it is essentially now going to fill that internal space with plaster, make a big plaster box around the outside, and so there will be plaster surrounding the pins on the outside, and then the pins through the wax of the sculpture will be embedded in wax on the inside. Once the wax is gone, those pins will hold the core in place. So you can see them here. If we looked at a cross section while we're melting the wax out of this mother mold, we now have a mold around the outside. You can see the wax is draining away. You can see the pins being held by the outer mold through the space where the wax was and embedded into the on the inside. That's going to hold that in place. Now we're going to heat the metal in a furnace until it becomes liquid, put into a large cup-like device that we call the crucible. It has a pouring spout on it, and we're going to pour that liquid metal right into the mold, and it's going to fill in the space where the wax used to be. In this shot, we're breaking that outer mold apart, and we should have a replica of the image that we created, including the sprues, now in metal. You can see that the pins are still there and the sprues, of course, have filled in, so those will have to be cut off. We can also open up the interior and take the plaster out from the inside in a process called chasing. That's what you're seeing here. So we end up with a replica in metal that looks exactly like the original piece that we started with. So this goes through the same process again, just with a slightly different diagram system. Here's our original clay example. I've put basically a mohawk around it so that I can easily remove the two halves of my outer mold. We call these shims that are kind of pressed into the clay. They make a little wall here. I've now made a mold around the outside. In the more contemporary mold making, I can use a synthetic rubber for this process. Once I have the rubber mold, I can take it apart easily because of where the shims were. I can coat the inside with wax, as you saw before. I can then put the mold back together and pour in what we call our investment, the plaster that becomes the core. Then I can take that mold off. I now have my wax replica with the core inside. I'm now pushing my pins through to hold the core. In this shot here, I'm adding sprues to make sure that the metal has somewhere to go. And then I'm going to make a mold around the whole of the outside of that. Now, this entire thing is basically solid all the way through now. We've got the plaster mold around the outside, around the wax. We've got the plaster inside the core. In order for the metal to go into, we have to get rid of the wax. So this whole mold is put into a kiln. We raise the temperature, and that melts the wax out. And so here you can see the wax running out of the sprues. We can see that the pins are there holding everything in place between the outer mold and the core. And now we're ready to pour molten metal in there. So here's our crucible, pouring the metal in. It's filling in where the sprues were. It's filling in all the details of the sculpture surrounding the core. When I'm done and it's cooled, I smash the outer mold off, and then I have to use a chisel or another electric tool to remove the sprues and the pins, and now I have a complete perfect replica of my original artwork. This gives you the same basic process, but in a contemporary foundry situation. So these are sculptures that are being cast. So here's our originals in clay. You can see the shims here as our artisan is applying the rubber mold on both sides. Once that rubber mold is taken apart, we line the inside of the mold with a thin layer of wax, and that's what's happening here. Then those two halves are put together. We pour the investment plaster inside, and we remove the mold. And so now we have a replica in wax with a solid plaster core. So we've still saved the original statue. In this shot, we're moving to a different object, but you can see the addition of the sprues. And the pouring cup, that's also going to be filled with wax. That's where the metal is going to be poured into. This is a ceramic shell that's being used for mold, and it doesn't have to be a huge box around the outside. The ceramic shell just needs to be a few inches in thickness around the object. So now that we have this entire object coated in our ceramic shell outer mold, we can melt the wax out in a furnace, or a kiln rather, and that's what's going on here. And now it's time to heat the metal to a liquid state. One of the materials that people use quite frequently for metal casting these days is bronze. So a lot of objects can be made either with bronze or, in this case, cast iron. So a lot of old-fashioned objects like radiators, heaters in older homes were made from cast iron. It can be broken back up into smaller pieces, placed into a furnace, which then is essentially layered. Coal, metal, coal, metal, coal, metal, and the whole thing is set on fire. And as the temperature reaches the right temperature, there's air forced through the whole system as well. When this is ready to go, we open the gate here, and liquid metal will pour out into our crucible. So there you get a shot of what that looks like. It's extremely hot. It's extremely dangerous, roughly 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. So you have to wear safety equipment. These are fire protective gloves, shoe coverings, leather gear to protect your body. It is not something you can really do successfully on your own. What you see here, though, is the crucible that the metal is going into is mounted on two long poles. So it really takes 3 people to accurately use this for pouring metal. Here's another crucible collar. You can see this end has handles on it that look kind of like a bicycle. There's a central space the crucible fits into, and then this other end of the handle is just straight across. The reason for that is that the person with the bicycle handle end is going to control tilting it. The person with the plain end is carrying the weight and allowing it to tilt, but does not control the ankle. The third person is monitoring where the spout is and watching how much metal is going in, because you really can't tell that from either of these two positions. Once the metal has been poured in and cooled, that outer shell can be taken off. Then the sprues have to be cut off, the pins have to be removed in the chasing process, and we end up going from an original in clay to a final in bronze or iron or whatever metal you're using. So we have several different examples that we've looked at throughout the semester of sculpture made with metal casting. It could be very representational or very abstract. You can create a variety of different textures from smooth to rough, as you see in these examples here. It's also interesting, I think, to think about sculpture in terms of how it looks from different angles. So to back up just for a second, this figure by Donatello is the David, but this image is what you think of when you think of the Renaissance sculpture of David, and they're obviously quite different. The traditional image of David is as a younger person rather than as a full-grown adult. Of David's defeat of Goliath, he is actually quite young in the story. So in the Renaissance, this was sort of the traditional way of depicting him. You see that the head of the giant is already under David's foot there, but in Michelangelo's version from the High Renaissance, there is no decapitated head. And if you look closely, you can see that the stone that he's going to use to take the giant out is still in his hand, and the sling is over his shoulder. So this is the moment before the action takes place. But this sculpture was meant to be positioned on top of the Florence Cathedral. And he would have had his back basically against the wall of the cathedral. It was meant to be seen from the front, as is Donatello's version. This version from the 1600s by the sculptor Bernini is meant to be viewed from all different sides. And you can see that he's also older, much like Michelangelo, but no decapitated head. But he's not standing still thinking about what he's going to do. He doesn't have the rock in his hand casually. He's already got the rock loaded into the sling. He is in the act of contorting his body and spinning so that he can let loose with this slingshot effect. So you can see that really when a sculpture is fully in the round, it can look very different from one angle to another. So the experience of viewing a sculpture is that really does take some time. Most sculptures don't have a single perfect point of view. They are meant to kind of encourage you to walk all the way. You can see how very different Bernini's David looks from these different angles. So you get a different feeling of movement, power, and even emotion from different sides. Very different from what Michelangelo did. This is a good example of a relief sculpture. This is another piece by the early Renaissance artist Donatello, and you can see that some areas are somewhat recessed, some areas protrude forward toward us in space, but essentially all of this image is made from essentially a flat background. Things are either recessed into or extend toward us. So you can look at relief, in this case, two relief sculptures of horses. This would be a good example of low relief, where it doesn't project all that much, but you see that it does project from its background. Here's a great example of high relief. These objects are so in relief that you can even see them kind of breaking forward and almost fully dimensional. You can put your hand around the forelegs, around the hooves on the front of those two horses. So your low relief is Ba, your high relief is Haute. We can talk about monumental sculpture. Here's a monument in multiple senses. This was meant to honor the Emperor Constantine. He reunified the eastern and western half of the Roman Empire and made Christianity legal to be practiced roughly around 300. And so Constantine, in part of his quest to kind of memorialize himself, aggrandize himself, and promote the strength of a single emperor over the entire Roman Empire, one of his goals was to present himself on a grand scale. So this sculpture was meant to be, in fact, was found in the ruins of a basilica that he built in Rome in the Roman space. one end of this massive building had a seated statue of the emperor in it. This is all that remains of it, but if you think about the size proportional rules that we learned, that from the Greek canon of proportions, the ideal body is either 7 or 8 heads in height. The head in this case is over 6 feet tall. So if you can imagine how enormous the statue would have been if it could stand up. So it's monumental, not only in a sense of being a monument, it's monumental in terms of being enormous. Installation sculpture, again, made from multiple individual pieces and kind of combined together to create an environment for one to walk through. So this installation is by Ed and Nancy Keinholz. It's entitled The Art Show. It's got some kind of interesting features. There's obviously people in an art gallery looking at art. There's an attendant who is selling the work. She has a cash register there as well. The faces, though, are a little scary. They look a little blank. They're missing eyes and noses and mouths, arguably. Instead of facial features, they have what are these rectangular or circular openings. Those are actually the vents from car heater air conditioner registers or exchanges. And so the floor actually has panels in it. So if you are standing close to this figure, your body weight on the panel in front of him will trigger a motor that'll blow air in your face. It's kind of a funny comment about people over talking and overthinking about art, right? You can see her cash register going, and you can see the registers in the kids' faces a little better. Earthworks is a category for sculpture, again, that takes place outdoors. This is one of the most iconic of the early earthworks from 1970 by Robert Smithson. It's called Spiral Jetty, and obviously it would have had to have been created using earth-moving equipment, bulldozers, cranes, etc. But this massive jetty extends out into the Great Salt Lake. It forms a spiral shape and is something you can actually go out into nature and see. There are driving directions, so you can drive out to see it, you can walk onto it, you can stand in the very center of it. So this was really a goal that Smithson had, was to make art that couldn't be owned by one individual person, art that could be in nature and made of nature. A more contemporary artist who we're looking at is Andy Goldsworthy. Andy Goldsworthy makes his earthworks generally from material he finds on site. Most of his work is made in such a way that it is not permanently affixed and can be then taken apart by nature itself. It will fall apart or decay. If it's made of ice, it will melt. If it's made of leaves, they will blow away eventually. His work is very much tied to the idea that we are temporary, that nature changes over time. And so the images that he makes are fully three-dimensional sculptural forms, but they are meant to exist in a temporary way. One of the things I really love about his work is that because it's temporary, it doesn't damage the world. He doesn't use chemicals. He doesn't use earth-moving equipment. He doesn't damage the world. He makes art of the natural environment itself. So you can imagine how incredible it would be to be walking through the woods and to discover one of these obviously objects, and then to see it decay rather quickly over a short period of time would be pretty interesting as well. These are more examples of his works. These are all made with leaves. Sand. I think we can all kind of relate to that, living near the beach. Stones. The one on the left is pretty remarkable. Those are held together by ice. So this was made in Japan in the winter. He poured water over the stones until the water froze. It took the better part of 3 days to create these. And then, of course, as soon as the temperature shifted and the ice melted, the sculpture fell apart. So it gives you a sense of the temporary nature. His work made with snow and ice is perhaps some of the most impressive of his work. My favorite is spiral made out of an icicle broken and then frozen back together to create this sort of Fibonacci spiral sequence. One thing to be aware of, though, is that his sculpture is very definitely non-objective. It's made out of recognizable things, twigs, leaves, but it doesn't create an image of a twig or a leaf. In this case, this piece is made of wood, but it doesn't create the image of a tree or the image of a branch. Whereas these pieces are also made out of wood, out of naturally found objects. This is the work of Deborah Butterfield, and they're clearly to represent things you can recognize from the real world. They're obviously horses. So Goldsworthy's work falls into the non-representational. Butterfield's, you could say, falls into representational category. The term kinetic we've talked a little bit about in the design lecture. The idea here is things that can move. So Alexander Calder's sculpture, he divided into two big categories. Kinetic sculptures he called mobiles, and his pieces that didn't move were called stabiles. Sculpture made of light is one of those things that's a little hard, I think, to get your mind around until you see it in person. I was not a huge fan myself until I saw an exhibition of work by several light sculptors in a very large gallery in Washington, D.C. So being able to be inside of these environments and walk through them really began to help me relate to them in a way that I couldn't grasp from a textbook or from even a video. One of the things, though, that does strike me is that we use color for emotional effect in so many areas of our lives. We do it in painting, obviously, we do it in clothing, but we certainly do it with lighting. If you think about the energy that can be generated at a concert or in a club based on the way light affects the room itself, the way the room is lit, the way the colors change, you get a sense of what a sculptor could do using light as a way of sculpting three-dimensional space. This is the work of James Turrell. It is essentially a non-denominational chapel. It is in a cemetery, so it could be used for anyone who is having to let a family member or a friend to rest. You can see that the colors of the chapel can be changed. The lights can create different moods based on the way that those colors change. Most famous sculpture made of light, though, was made after 9/11. It was beams of light that were projected from ground zero into the sky that really sort of put the towers back in space, but were transparent and ephemeral, a very effective emotional statement that kind of spoke about the loss, but also about the recovery. Definitely, we have artists in contemporary sculpture who are working in a variety of different ways. Most of the most successful contemporary sculptors tend to work in fairly abstract ways. This is the work of Isamu Noguchi. Fletcher Benton working in assemblage welded steel. Marc de Souvero also in welded steel. A lot of artists use this particular material in the latter half of the 20th century. And Martin Puryear is a pretty fascinating artist who you have to do a little bit of research, I think, into the meanings behind his sculptures, because they're quite often references to himself, references to his experiences as African-American male in the 20th and 21st century, but they're done in such a way that they are very non-objective, abstract forms. It's kind of a fascinating thing to look at the different ways that sculpture could be used to address a number of different issues, whether that be a personal history or a political statement.